At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? My name's Carol. Let's begin. Of all the ways Gibson Drake had imagined starting an interstellar war, a flickering light bulb wasn't his first choice, nor was it the most exciting. It was a very expensive, anti-gravity, jewel-encrusted light bulb, but a light bulb nonetheless. He stood on the human diplomatic platform in the Nexus's grand chamber, a cavernous space of polished chrome and condescending architecture, and radiated quiet fury. The fury was visible only in the knot of muscle twitching in his jaw. He was supposed to be in the workshop, elbow deep in the greasy guts of a cargo hauler's grav plates. He found a deep, soul-cleansing comfort in quantifiable problems and the honest scent of ozone and hot metal. Instead, he was here. He was here because Ambassador Aurelia Corvus's personal floating podium had started to flicker 10 minutes before her grand address. She had personally demanded a human mechanic, a summons delivered with a tone most species reserve for summoning a sanitation drone to incinerate organic waste. She trusted neither the station's unionized maintenance crews, who she deemed indolent, nor her own Elysian technicians, whom she considered far too refined for such grimy physical labor. Gibson had located and reseated the faulty power coupling in under 90 seconds. His reward for this feat of interstellar handiwork was a silken instruction to remain present in the unlikely event your crude repairs falter. So, here he stood, a prisoner of diplomatic procedure, watching the Elysian ambassador gesture with languid grace at a floor-to-ceiling hologram. The image was a painstakingly reconstructed skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, rendered in bone-white light that glimmered against the chamber's soft, ambient glow. It was a monument to a world long dead, a ghost conjured for a lecture. The data, meticulously compiled over decades of laborious research into the Terran archives, is unequivocal, Aurelia droned. Her voice, a melodic instrument of patronizing authority, echoed through the chamber. The file designated the Apex Protocol, which has generated such undue agitation among the more excitable members of this council, must refer to a genetic revival of this particular creature. A mindless beast, I'm certain. An engine of pure instinct. No doubt confined within a secure facility. A biological deterrent of formidable, if unsophisticated, power. Gibson snorted. The sound was a short, sharp burst of air forced through his nostrils. In the cathedral-like hush of the grand chamber, it was as subtle as a thrown wrench. Hundreds of alien eyes, in varying numbers, arrangements, and spectral sensitivities, swiveled toward him. Aurelia's speech faltered mid-syllable. Her thin, elegant lips, which had been forming a word about primitive threat postures, compressed into a line of distilled disdain. Her pale, almost translucent skin flushed a delicate shade of mauve. Her species lacked the biological vulgarity of blushing, but unbridled rage gave her a certain incandescent quality. Does the human mechanic have a contribution to offer? She inquired, her voice dripping with venom. She drew out the word mechanic as if it were a contagion she was attempting to expel from her mouth. Gibson straightened from his indolent slouch against the podium's base. A slow grin spread across his face. A predator's grin. The kind of expression that made seasoned bartenders quietly polish a glass while easing their hand toward the panic button. He leaned forward, just enough for his voice to carry without a shout. "Yeah," he said. His voice was a low rumble of gravel and engine grease, a stark counterpoint to Aurelia's silver bell condescension. "You're barking up the wrong fossil. The apex predator isn't extinct, and it's sure as hell not a lizard." He tapped his own chest with a grease-stained thumb. "You're looking at him. I'm right here." A ripple of sound moved through the chamber. It started as confused murmurs, which quickly coalesced into a wave of condescending alien titters. The very notion was preposterous, a joke in exceptionally poor taste. A single, soft-skinned bipedal mammal, a creature whose primary evolutionary advantages appeared to be perspiration and anxiety, claiming a title that a generation of xenobiologists had bestowed upon a 40-foot, 6-ton engine of destruction? Aurelia regarded him with a look of disgust so profound it verged on performance art, as if he were a sentient fungus that had just impunged her maternal lineage. She inhaled, her chest rising as she prepared to deliver a verbal evisceration, a withering retort so perfectly crafted it would be studied in diplomatic academies for centuries. She never uttered a single word of it. The sound was a physical event, a geological shift in the station's reality. A deep, grinding boom that vibrated through the deck plates and rattled the teeth in their sockets. Priceless sculptures from a dozen worlds trembled, and one particularly fragile Elysian masterpiece, a delicate glass-spun representation of inevitable sorrow, simply disintegrated into a cloud of glittering dust. A proximity alarm, a frantic, shrieking synthetic voice, blared through the station's comms. "Warning! Unidentified vessel. Proximity breach. Quadrant 9. Every eye in the chamber, biological and synthetic, instinctively turned to the grand chamber's majestic viewport. One moment, the viewport was a crystal-clear window onto the star-dusted tapestry of space. The next, 100,000 tons of station atmosphere attempted to occupy the same vacuum at the same exact instant. The magnificent window did not simply break. It ceased to be. The armored plasteel atomized, transforming into an expanding cloud of glittering, hypersonic shrapnel that scythed through the front rows of delegates. The attack was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. The invaders had not relied on fortune. They had used the Council's own suffocating obsession with procedure against them. The diplomatic arrival of the veiled emissary of Cathar was a meticulously engineered fiction, a Trojan horse built of paperwork and precedent. The ancient protocols they had invoked, the very same ones Aurelia herself championed as a sign of respect for galactic tradition, mandated both the lowering of the quadrant's shields and the temporary deactivation of the point defense grid to, quote, avoid sensor interference with their delicate, historically significant systems. The Council hadn't just been attacked. They had held the door open, laid out a welcome mat, and unplugged the security cameras. The first shockwave of depressurization struck the chamber like a giant's fist. Holographic emitters ripped from their ceiling mounts, and esteemed diplomats, beings who could topple empires with a pointed clause in a trade agreement, tumbled through the air like discarded dolls. An archivist from Parkerusadar, named Parker, a frail-looking creature with 4 large, expressive eyes that were currently wide with abject terror, shrieked and scrambled to a nearby terminal. His slender, 6-jointed fingers danced across the console. "The emissary protocols!" he squeaked, his voice a high-pitched crackle of panic. "They demanded we lower the quadrant shields. They insisted the point defense grid be placed in standby. A direct violation of 300 years of established safety regulations, but the diplomatic corps overruled security. We did this to ourselves." Through the newly formed hole in reality, a ship slammed into the station's superstructure. Its design was an exercise in brutalist pragmatism, a heavily armored crawl mercenary dropship, shaped like a brick with oversized engines bolted on as a crude afterthought. Its hull was a patchwork of scars and pitted welds, a visual history of 100 dirty little wars fought in the galaxy's unlit corners. The shriek of tearing metal and the frantic blare of vacuum alarms composed a terrifying new symphony. Heavy mag grapple lines dropped from the ship's belly, and figures began to rappel down. They were Crawl, their bronze-hued skin visible beneath bulky, functional armor plated with a blade of ceramics. Their four-fingered hands clutched heavy plasma rifles that were already spitting incandescent bolts of turquoise energy into the chamber, turning priceless artifacts and panicked diplomats into sizzling heaps. The age of protocol had ended. The age of violence had just arrived. The collected ambassadors of the Galactic Council, who only moments before had been debating the finer points of interstellar terraflaw, reacted with a collective, high-pitched scream. They dove for cover behind ornamental furniture, their dignity forgotten. Ambassador Aurelia, the picture of refined superiority, let out a pathetic, breathy squeak and fainted with elegance onto her now darkened podium. Two Crawl mercenaries landed on the human platform with the heavy, magnetic thud of mag-locked boots. Their rifles swiveled towards Gibson. Their compound eyes, shifting through 100 tiny lenses, registered him not as a threat, but as a target of convenience. A soft-skinned primitive, an easy kill to inaugurate the glorious slaughter. It was their final, fatal miscalculation. Before a trigger could be depressed, Gibson moved. A single fluid motion saw him rip the meter-long decorative metal strut from the side of the podium he had just repaired. The Elysian alloy, designed for aesthetic appeal and not for torsional stress, groaned in metallic protest before tearing free with a sharp screech. He spun, using the strut as a quarterstaff. The first blow was a vicious, short-range thrust. The hardened end of the strut connected with the lead mercenary squarely in the throat, bypassing the armored gorget with a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. The alien emitted a wet, gurgling sound and dropped his rifle, his four-fingered hands clawing uselessly at his ruined neck. The second mercenary, momentarily frozen by the sheer, brutal velocity of the attack, tried to bring his rifle to bear. Gibson dropped low, sweeping the strut in a brutal arc that connected with the Crawl's knee. A wet snap echoed, audible even over the chaos. The alien's leg bent at an angle nature had never conceived, and he collapsed with a howl of agony. As the second merc fell, Gibson brought the strut down in a final, decisive overhead slam. The blow caved in the first one's helmet with the sound of a dropped melon. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 seconds. It was messy. It was ugly. It was kinetics, applied with extreme prejudice. The half-dozen other Crawl mercenaries scattered throughout the chamber paused their indiscriminate slaughter. They had anticipated screaming, cowering prey. They had not anticipated a soft-skinned creature dismantling 2 of their trained soldiers with a piece of decorative furniture. This brief hesitation was a gift, a momentary lull in the hurricane of violence. Gibson had no intention of wasting it. Gibson's eyes swept the chaos. He saw the terrified, whimpering form of Parker, the Parcrucidar archivist, cowering behind the data console. Parker's 4 eyes were wide with a terror so pure, it was almost sublime. He looked as if he were 3 seconds from his heart staging a violent protest and making a break for it out of his chest. "Stay behind me, bookworm," Gibson barked, his voice a drill sergeant's command that cut through the din. "And try not to void your bladder on my boots. It's hell on the leather." He needed a better weapon. He needed an exit. His eyes landed on the floating podium drone Aurelia had used, now hovering aimlessly a foot off the floor, its anti-grav unit still humming. An idea, both terrible and beautiful, sparked in his mind. He leaped over the twitching bodies of the Crawl, landing beside the podium. He yanked a side panel off with a screech of protesting metal and went to work. His fingers, stained with grease, but moving with an intuitive speed, found the power core. Parker watched from his hiding spot, his horror momentarily eclipsed by a morbid fascination. "By the Great Archive, you can't do that!" he shrieked, his voice trembling. "That's an Elysian harmonic projector! You can't just bypass the regulators and shove raw amperage into the focusing crystal! You'll desynchronize the containment field, and it'll flash fry everything in a 50-meter radius." Gibson didn't look up from his frantic rewiring. "Only if you're a delicate Elysian engineer who's afraid of scratching the pay and follows the 37-step safety checklist," he grunted. He stripped 2 thick wires with his teeth and spat the plastic insulation onto the deck. "Human stuff is built on the core assumption that someday a stressed-out grunt with a multi-tool and a roll of electrical tape will need to make it do something the designers never intended. Our wires are color-coded for idiots. This thing is practically begging to be turned into a weapon." He twisted the wires together, jammed the exposed power cell against the back of the hollow emitter, and gave the entire jury-rig contraption a firm, encouraging slap. The drone whined, a high-pitched, angry sound, like a nest of disturbed hornets. More crawl were massing at the chamber's main entrance, setting up a heavy plasma-repeating cannon. Others were cutting through the sealed blast doors on the far side with a plasma torch, sending showers of molten metal onto the priceless carpets. Gibson shoved the wobbling, whining drone toward those doors. "Cover your ears!" he yelled. The drone vomited raw energy. A blinding, white-hot pulse erupted from the emitter, turning the air to plasma and striking the blast door with the force of a shaped charge. The meter-thick plasteel didn't melt or vaporize. It blew inward, a glowing, semi-molten slab of metal that crushed the 2 soldiers behind it and scoured the corridor beyond with incandescent fury. Gibson grabbed Parker by the back of his robes. "Time to go." He dragged the still-shrieking archivist through the smoking, freshly minted exit and into the chaos of the main concourse, the screams of the council fading behind them. They found refuge in a dark, narrow service corridor. The distant sounds of plasma fire and panicked screams echoed like angry ghosts in the metallic guts of the station. Parker was hyperventilating, his thin chest heaving. He leaned against a grimy wall, his 4 eyes screwed shut, as if he could unsee the last 10 minutes. "They were screaming about the Apex Protocol," he stammered, his voice ragged. "Even the mercenaries, they kept just shouting it." He fumbled for his datapad, his shaking fingers struggling to connect its interface cable to a wall terminal. I can access the Council's, threat assessment files. It's my specialty. Perhaps if we know what they're searching for." The screen lit up, bathing his terrified face in a pale blue light. He typed a series of commands, his professional instincts briefly overriding his panic. A file appeared on the screen. Council Analysis. Terran Threat Vector 9 Gamma. Apex Protocol. "Oh," Parker whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh, by the archives. This is catastrophic." He scrolled through the file, his eyes widening with each new page. "Speculation. The Apex Protocol refers to a Terran bioweapon, a creature capable of prolonged metabolic hibernation. See attached satellite imagery of Ursus arctos horribilis." An image of a massive, brown-furred grizzly bear appeared on the screen, its fangs bared in a silent, 2-dimensional roar. He swiped again. "Further analysis suggests the Apex may be a pack-based predator, capable of coordinated tactical assault. See file on Canis lupus." A holographic wolf snarled silently on the datapad. He kept scrolling, his face growing paler. Addendum. Intelligence suggests the Terrans have weaponized their avians. See file on Answer. A creature known for its extreme territorial aggression and coordinated flanking maneuvers. They think Earth has a secret army of giant bears, super wolves, and death squads of geese? Gibson let out a laugh. It was a harsh, humorless bark that echoed in the narrow corridor. "You want to know a secret, Parker?" he said, leaning against the opposite wall, and checking the charge on a plasma pistol he'd scooped up from a dead crawl.
Terran intelligence let your people steal this file a decade ago. Every bite of it. It's a ghost. A masterpiece of misdirection. A wild goose chase designed to make y'all look for a monster in a cage, so you'd never bother to look at the monster standing right next to you.
He holstered the pistol and looked Parker straight in his 4 terrified eyes.
It's not a biology report, bookworm. It's a psychological profile. Battle doctrine. It's a break glass in case of total war file describing the operational mindset of the human species when pushed into a corner. It's not about what we have. It's about what we become.
The realization dawned on Parker's face. A slow, creeping horror that was far more profound than the immediate fear of the mercenaries. The council had not just been wrong. They had been played for fools from the very beginning, and they had never even suspected. The hunt was on. Crawl squads, systematic and relentless, swept through the station's corridors. Their progress was a rhythmic stomp of mag boots, punctuated by the sporadic chatter of plasma fire. Gibson and Parker were forced deeper into the station's bowels, herded like vermin through maintenance tunnels and forgotten access ways thick with dust and the ghosts of forgotten repair crews. They rounded a corner and stumbled into a cavernous maintenance sector. The outer wall was a jagged tear of twisted metal, a wound opening directly into the star-dusted blackness. The sector's atmosphere vented into space, and a silent, crystalline plume of frozen gas. In the zero-gravity environment, the crawl held a clear advantage. Their heavy boots were magnetized, allowing them to clomp along the walls and ceiling like monstrous bronze-plated insects. They leveled their rifles on the 2 figures floating helplessly in the middle of the chamber. Gibson was adrift, an easy target. His mind raced, processing the physics of the problem, while Parker flailed uselessly, yelping as he bumped into a floating toolbox. Gibson acted. He snagged the floating maintenance kit, pulling out a heavy magnetic clamp used for hull repairs. He slapped it onto the deck, activated it with a click, and tethered his belt to its anchor point with a short utility strap. He was anchored. The environment was now his weapon. A wall-walking mercenary fired a plasma bolt that sizzled past Gibson's head, leaving a brief, hot afterimage. Gibson grabbed a discarded length of pipe floating nearby. He planted his feet, bent his knees, and pushed off the floor with all his might, launching himself across the chamber like a missile. He slammed into the crawl on the wall, using their combined momentum to drive the alien backward into a cluster of exposed, sparking power conduits. The mercenary convulsed as thousands of volts surged through his armor, his limbs locking in a grotesque spasm before he went limp. Gibson kicked off the wall, his trajectory sending him spinning back towards the floor. Another mercenary, crawling along the ceiling like a nightmare insect, took aim. Gibson grabbed the leg of a third crawl who was clomping along the floor toward him. Using his anchored position as a fulcrum, Gibson swung the surprised alien in a wide, brutal circle. The mercenary, now a 200-pound flail, smashed into his comrade on the ceiling. Both went spinning off into the void through the breach in the hull, their screams silenced by the vacuum. It was a brutal, disorienting ballet of violence, a perfect demonstration of a creature adapting to a hostile environment in real time and turning its enemy's strengths into catastrophic weaknesses. They escaped the maintenance sector and found themselves in a massive cargo bay, a space the size of an ancient Terran football stadium. Towering stacks of alien cargo containers formed a metallic maze. The rhythmic clank of crawl patrols echoed through the cavernous space, pinning them down behind a stack of crates labeled in a language that looked like angry spaghetti. Then, Gibson saw it. Parked in a charging station was a heavy-duty, over-engineered cargo forklift, its massive prongs capable of lifting 20 tons. A few meters away, a discarded crawl plasma cannon lay on the deck, its proprietary power pack shattered by a stray shot. A feral grin,
The kind that promised glorious, large-scale property damage spread across Gibson's face. His eyes landed on the forklift, then the cannon. In his mind, the two objects didn't just sit there. They clicked together, with the satisfying logic of a perfectly machined gear. A 400 megawatt hydraulic battery. A magnetic containment chamber in need of a power source. It was not an idea. It was a schematic, drawing itself in his brain in grease and adrenaline.
"Parker, buy me 3 minutes,"
he yelled, already sliding on his belly toward the machine.
"How?"
Parker squeaked, peeking over the top of a crate.
"What can I possibly do?" "You're the archivist. Your job is to organize information. So, disorganize something. Cause some archival chaos."
A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just desperation, lit up Parker's 4 eyes. He plugged his datapad into a nearby cargo management terminal. While Gibson got to work, Parker became a digital ghost in the machine. He triggered a series of false fire alarms, dropping torrents of thick, vision-obscuring flame-retardant foam in strategic locations, sowing confusion among the crawl squads. He rerouted power from life support to a bank of industrial charging stations, causing them to overload and explode in a series of violent, concussive blasts that sent metal sheeting spinning through the air. He even hacked the bay's primary automated crane, sending a multi-ton cargo container swinging wildly through the area on its magnetic tether, forcing the mercenaries to scatter like frightened insects. The symphony of chaos gave Gibson the window he needed. He tore open the forklift's main access panel, revealing its massive power source, a battery designed to run for a month of continuous heavy lifting. He bypassed its safety regulators with a well-placed wrench and a length of copper wire. Ignoring the warning labels written in 5 different languages, he hardwired the battery's main output directly to the plasma cannon's primary capacitor. The cannon, now tethered to the forklift by a thick, sparking cable, hummed with a dangerous amount of raw, unstable power. Gibson leaped into the driver's seat, slammed the accelerator, and roared the forklift to life. He plowed through a stack of flimsy shipping containers, bursting into the open. The jury-rigged cannon, mounted precariously on the lift mechanism, roared. A blast of plasma, twice as large and far more destructive than a standard shot, slammed into a crawl squad taking cover behind a bulkhead, turning their position into a puddle of molten metal. Gibson was no longer just a mechanic. He was the captain of a mobile artillery platform, built from scrap and desperation. He crashed the smoking, sparking forklift through a reinforced wall and into the sudden, opulent quiet of a cordoned-off luxury lounge. Ambassador Aurelia and her personal Elysian honor guards, clad in ceremonial silver armor that gleamed under the soft lighting, had barricaded themselves inside. They stared at the smoking, jury-rigged war machine and the battle-hardened, grime-covered human as its controls. Aurelia's composure, already cracked, shattered completely.
"You!"
she shrieked, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at him.
"You are more dangerous than they are. You bring chaos and death wherever you go. Guards, apprehend this brute. We can trade him to the invaders for our own safety."
Her 2 guards hesitated. Their training was for ceremony and the occasional diplomatic scuffle, not for facing down a wild-eyed human armed with a weapon that violated at least 17 laws of thermodynamics. They looked at Gibson, then at the still-glowing barrel of his cannon, and appeared to be seriously reconsidering their career choices. Gibson didn't give them time to decide. He vaulted off the forklift before it had even skidded to a halt. In 2 quick strides, he was on the lead guard. He didn't throw a punch. He headbutted him, the sharp crack of cartilage echoing in the silent room. The guard crumpled with a groan. Gibson snatched the guard's ornate energy pistol from its holster, spun, and grabbed Aurelia, pulling her in front of him as a humanoid shield. He leveled the pistol at the remaining stunned guard.
Diplomacy,
he yelled, the word dripping with sarcasm. He shoved the sputtering ambassador back towards her guard, sending them both stumbling backward. Before they could recover, Gibson was gone, scrambling up a stack of overturned furniture and disappearing into a large ventilation shaft set high on the wall. Crawling through the dusty, cramped ventilation system, Gibson came to a stark realization. The Nexus was a lost cause. It was too big, too compromised. He couldn't save it. He had to take the fight to the enemy. He and a very reluctant Parker, whom Gibson had to physically drag into the vents, fought their way through the station's infrastructure, navigating a maze of conduits and crawl spaces. They emerged near Docking Bay 12, just in time to see the crawl leader, a hulking brute named Harkin, whose armor was adorned with the skulls of his enemies, boarding his personal dropship. The ramp was closing.
"No time for subtlety,"
Gibson shouted, breaking into a dead sprint. He slid across the polished deck, feet first, like a baseball player stealing home. He shot under the heavy metal ramp just as it sealed with a heavy hydraulic hiss, tumbling onto the deck inside the ship. Parker, who had tripped and was rolling behind him, barely made it through before the ramp locked. Inside the cockpit, a brutal, close-quarters brawl erupted. Harkin was twice Gibson's size and all muscle. He roared and swung a fist that could dent plasteel. The ship, its controls unmanned, took off with a lurch, its autopilot trying to execute its last programmed command. It climbed, then banked sharply, spiraling out of control. During a violent barrel roll that sent tools and unsecured equipment flying, Gibson saw his chance. He kicked the ramp release lever. The ramp whined open, revealing the dizzying superstructure of the Nexus rushing past. Gibson planted his feet, and as the ship pitched, he delivered a powerful kick to Harkin's chest, booting the Crawl warlord out into open space. Harkin's roar was cut short as he slammed into one of the station's massive communication spires and vanished in a shower of sparks and shattered armor. Gibson threw himself into the pilot seat, grabbing the alien controls. They felt slick and wrong under his hands. Strange symbols glowed on the displays.
"I can't read this crap,"
he yelled over the roar of the engines.
"Parker, find me the inertial dampeners. Now!"
Parker, looking greener than usual, scrambled to a co-pilot console and jacked in his datapad. Alien script scrolled past his 4 eyes at a dizzying speed.
"The schematic is a chaotic mess,"
he stammered, fighting off nausea.
But the energy signature is consistent with the primary stabilization system. It's the blue rune glowing on your right."
Gibson looked at the control board.
"They're all glowing blue runes, you idiot." The one with the swirly bits!"
Parker shrieked.
No, the other one with the swirly bits."
With Parker navigating the ship's labyrinthine software and Gibson wrestling the physical controls, they managed to tame the bucking vessel. The wild spiraling slowly subsided, and the dropship settled into a stable, if shaky, flight, leaving the besieged station behind. Aboard the stolen ship, now in a quiet, stable orbit, Gibson had Parker, who was just finishing throwing up in a storage locker, slice into the ship's navigation logs and communication buffers. They expected to find mercenary contracts and payment schedules. They found something infinitely worse. Encrypted communications, sliced and decrypted by Parker's frantic genius, revealed the identity of their employer, Overlord Vassar, of the Vorlag hegemony. The Vorlag were not mercenaries. They were conquerors, a brutal, expansionist power from the galaxy's lawless outer rim. The attack on the Nexus wasn't the main event. It was just a test. A violent probe to gauge the Council's response time and military readiness. Its secondary objective was to confirm the location of the Council's files on the Apex Protocol. The real prize, the target of the entire operation, was Earth. As if on cue, a proximity alert chirped from the console. Parker pulled up the long-range sensors. A fleet of massive, brutal-looking warships dropped out of FTL at the edge of the system, their forms resolving out of the shimmering distortion of space-time. At their head was a vessel of obscene size, a dreadnought bristling with weapon emplacements. The World Ender. The Crawl had not been there to rob the place. They were just the opening act for a full-scale invasion. Gibson knew he couldn't stop a fleet with a single battered dropship. He needed guns, he needed pilots, he needed people who hated the established order as much as he did. He flew the dropship to the station's underbelly, to the lawless, disused recycling sectors that had, over the decades, become a black market and smuggler's den, known only as the Sump. When he landed, the whispers were already slithering through the shadows. News traveled fast in the criminal underworld. The story of the berserker human who had dismantled a Crawl fire team with a piece of railing and turned a forklift into a weapon of mass destruction had spread like wildfire. He wasn't just a target anymore. He was a legend in the making. He found Nyx, a Pelagian amphibian pilot with webbed hands and eyes that missed nothing, arguing furiously with a Crawl collaborator over her impounded ship in a dingy cantina that smelled of stale beer and desperation.
They seized my cargo, my ship, everything! Said it was for the war effort!
She was shouting, her voice a series of angry croaks that made the glasses on the bar rattle. Gibson stepped out of the shadows. "I can get you your ship back," he said, his voice calm. "And a shot at the bastards who took it." Nyx looked him up and down, taking in the blood and grime. A slow, toothy grin spread across her wide mouth. "You're him, aren't you? The forklift guy?" Later, he found Draxus, a disgraced honor-bound warrior, in a gladiatorial pit, fighting with a cold, terrifying fury. The honor-bound of Thrax were known for their rigid code of honor, and Draxus had been exiled for refusing to bow to the Vorlag when they conquered his homeworld. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his twin vibroblades a blur of silver. After the match, as Draxus cleaned his blades, Gibson approached. "I hear you have a disagreement with the Vorlag," he said. Draxus didn't look up. He just spat on the sand-covered floor. "They are honorless dogs who rule through fear. My people bowed to them. I did not." Gibson grinned. "Their overlord is here, and that big, ugly ship hanging over our heads. I'm gonna kill him. I could use a warrior who isn't afraid to die." Draxus's eyes, flat and dead moments before, lit up with a purpose that wasn't just about survival. He rose to his full, towering height. "Where do we begin?" The legend had provided the introduction. Gibson had provided the target. His ragtag crew was assembled. The World Ender was too powerful for a direct assault. Trying to fight it head-on would be suicide. Gibson's plan was, therefore, completely insane. Get inside it. Their target was the station's primary shipyard, a vast complex of docks and repair bays, where the Vorlag were preparing to dock the dreadnought to offload their main invasion force. The team launched a chaotic, multi-pronged assault. Nyx, back in the cockpit of her souped-up freighter, the Rogue Gambit, became a phantom. She provided air support, her nimble ship dancing through Vorlag fighter patrols, drawing their fire with high-G maneuvers that would have turned a lesser pilot into a thin paste on the back of their chair. On the ground, Draxus became a one-man army. He created a massive diversion, planting a stolen demolition charge on a primary fuel depot. The resulting explosion was biblical, a blossoming flower of fire and shrapnel that ripped a gaping hole in the shipyard's outer defenses
and sent the Vorlag ground troops scrambling. In the ensuing confusion, Gibson and Parker piloted their captured crawl dropship on a screaming suicide run. They flew straight through the fire and chaos, their destination, the Dreadnought's primary boarding ramp, a massive slab of armor that was just beginning to extend towards the docking port. Plasma fire from the Dreadnought's point defense cannons stitched lines of fire across their hull, but they didn't stop. They crash-landed the dropship inside the cavernous hangar bay of the World Ender, skidding across the deck in a shower of sparks and screeching metal. The scale of the ship was obscene. The hangar alone could have held a small city. The corridors they ran down weren't hallways. They were industrial canyons, filled with colossal machinery and cargo containers the size of apartment buildings. Suddenly, the ship-wide comm crackled to life. Overlord Vassar's deep, rumbling voice filled the corridor, not with anger, but with a calm, predatory amusement.
I have studied your species' psychological profile, human. Your predictable affinity for dramatic gestures. I knew you would seek the heart of my ship. Engineering. A predictable choice for a mechanic.
The voice was smooth, confident.
You believe you are being clever. In truth, you are walking into a cage.
As he spoke, the Vorlag patrols that had been swarming the corridors vanished. The path ahead seemed clear. Too clear. Parker hesitated, his hand on Gibson's arm.
Gibson, it's a trap.
Gibson grinned, tapping a schematic he'd downloaded from the shipyard's master control.
Of course it's a trap. What he doesn't know is that he's leading us right where I want to go.
They reached the main engineering hub, the chamber that housed the massive power converters for the Dreadnought's spinal cannon. It was a cathedral of power, dominated by a colossal energy conduit that pulsed with a malevolent red light. The moment they were inside, meter-thick blast doors slammed shut, sealing them in. Red combat lighting flooded the room. Overlord Vassar stepped from the shadows. His power armor, forged from the hulls of conquered flagships, hummed with latent energy. In his hand, he held a massive power axe that crackled with a disruptive energy field.
Welcome, Apex Predator,
he rumbled. As Vassar engaged Gibson in a brutal duel, his elite guard, hulking Vorlag berserkers, advanced on Parker, who was frantically working at a control console. The fight was a blur of motion. Vassar was remarkably strong and fast, his axe cleaving chunks from the deck plates with every swing. Gibson was a whirlwind of motion, dodging, weaving, using his smaller size and agility to stay alive, landing blows with a pipe he'd ripped from the wall that barely seemed to phase the Overlord's armor. A stray plasma bolt from one of the guards struck the console Parker was using. It exploded in a shower of sparks, and a critical power converter flew across the room, landing near the far wall. The system was dead. Parker, who had spent the entire story hiding, screaming, and fainting, looked at Gibson. The human was pinned down, Vassar's axe held at bay only by the straining length of pipe. He was losing. Something inside Parker snapped. With a terrified squeal that sounded almost like a war cry, he dropped to the floor. An army crawled across the deck, plasma bolts searing the air above his head. He reached the smoking component, snatched it up, and scrambled back to the console. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely guide it home, but he shoved it back into the smoking socket. The console flickered, then lit up green. "It's ready!" Parker screamed, a strange mix of terror and triumph in his voice. Gibson, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side with a fresh break, saw his opening. He looked past Vassar to the floor plating beneath the Overlord's feet. It was a reinforced section,
marked with glowing Vorlag warning runes. The schematic had shown him exactly what it was: the armored housing for the spinal weapon's primary energy conduit. "You cannot win!" Visar roared, raising his axe for the final blow. "My armor's regenerating! My ship is secure! You have failed!" Gibson, disengaging and sprinting towards Parker at the console, shouted back, "I know!" He feinted left, tricking Visar into a powerful charge that landed the Overlord squarely on top of the marked plating. Visar's roar of triumph died in his throat. He looked down at the runes beneath his feet. Then at the main firing console Gibson was sprinting towards. He saw the schematic on Gibson's datapad. The trap wasn't for the human. It was for him. His eyes widened in horrified understanding a split second before the world turned white. Gibson slammed his fist down on the firing stud. Parker, his expression raw with exhilaration, screamed and diverted all power from the ship's main reactor into the weapon system. The World Ender screamed. Its main weapon fired, a beam of incandescent energy lacing out into the void and vaporizing a sizable but barren moon. But that was just a side effect. The primary goal was achieved, as the overloaded energy conduit beneath Visar's feet ruptured catastrophically. The armored plating buckled and split. A column of pure, white-hot energy erupted from the floor. Overlord Visar was vaporized from the feet up, his final, surprised roar cut short. The dreadnought began to tear itself apart from the inside, chain reactions of exploding power systems ripping through its spine. They escaped, linking up with Nyx and Draxus in the chaos, and blasting their way out of the hangar on the rogue Gambit, just as the World Ender blossomed into a silent, miniature star. Back on the battered but secure Nexus, the surviving council members, including a pale and trembling Ambassador Aurelia, stared at the wreckage of the Vorlag fleet displayed on the main view screen. The remnants of the invasion force, leaderless and broken, were scattering into the void. They looked at Gibson. He was leaning against a wall, covered in grime, dried blood, and hydraulic fluid. A makeshift sling made from a torn uniform supported his broken arm. He popped a real, antique Terran filter-tipped cigarette he'd been saving for a special occasion into his mouth. Nyx, standing beside him with her arms crossed, lit it for him with a small plasma torch she used for soldering. Aurelia stepped forward, trying to reclaim some shred of authority, her voice shaky but still laced with arrogance. "The Council thanks the human for his crude but effective assistance. His methods were unorthodox and will be logged. His conduct will be reviewed by a subcommittee." Gibson just looked at her. He took a long, slow drag from his cigarette, held it for a moment, and then blew the smoke directly into her face. She flinched back, sputtering. He turned his gaze from her to the rest of the silent, awestruck room. "See?" he said, his voice raspy from smoke and shouting. "That's the difference. You've been looking for a monster, a big, dumb animal, something you can put in a chart and classify." He gestured with his cigarette towards the view screen. "Everything else in the galaxy, your T-Rex, your wolves, your crawl mercenaries, your Vorlag warlords, they kill to live. It's about territory, food, conquest." He grinned, a feral, bloody expression that sent a collective shiver through the chamber. "Humans, we live to protect, and we will kill anything and everything that threatens what is ours. It's not instinct." He took one last drag, the cherry glowing bright in the dim light. He flicked the cigarette onto the pristine, pearlescent floor of the grand chamber, where it smoldered like a dying star. It's a promise.